Ladies and gentlemen, folks who are still looking at our beautiful permanent collection, if you'd like to have a seat. Mr. King, Ms. Kleinman. Oh, more people are coming in. That's good. I'm very excited to see how excited you are to see the permanent collection on view again. I want to mention a little bit about that. My name is Elizabeth Peterson. I think I know almost everybody there, but in case I haven't met you, I'm the director of the museum, and tonight's lecture will be by our Curator of Collections, John Tilford, my one and only colleague, and the person with whom I've built this collection. He is part and parcel of this place. We arrived about 6 months apart from one another, and it's been a synergy that I could not have dreamed. We shore each other up, and we rarely butt heads, despite the fact that we're incredibly different people. But we
it's
have...
because you're so nice. I don't know him.
Claire.
Oh, she vouches for
Oh,
him.
absolutely. I vouch for him as well. A couple little housekeeping items. This is our first lecture of the series for the spring, and we just got our spring events listing. Which, for those of you who might have low vision, I apologize. It's very lovely and maybe a little hard to read because it's not quite so high contrast. But tonight's lecture is the first, and we have events all the way through mid-May, through graduation. And John will tell you a lot about this collection. I just want to mention, too, we're very happy to have the very first piece on view that was collected by my predecessor, the founding director, Lloyd Mick. This summer, we will actually take down all of this collection and reinstall the entire museum with nothing but permanent collection. And we're in the process, I'll be quick, I'm sorry. We're in the process of doing interviews with longtime members. If you are interested, please talk to me. We are also doing that with staff members and faculty and students. And we're reaching out to a lot of members of the community to do really quick interviews. What's your connection to the museum? What's your favorite piece? What's the history? Just a little anecdote, we talked to Barb Henry, who a lot of you know, an alumna who's worked here for 30 years now. And she said she helped install the Buddha show in 1986. So we've got a lot of people with a lot of amazing and long history. But tonight, John's going to speak with you. John has a pedigree so long I can't even begin to talk about it. But he studied at Oxford. His depth of knowledge is staggering, but he uses his powers for good. And he's going to dazzle you this evening with this embarrassment of riches. It was a very long intro, but there you go, John.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Al Ginsberg's here this evening. He's heard me say this before, and I'm going to say it again, Al. I never work a day in my life since I've come to Oglethorpe 5 years and 1 month ago. I love what I do. It's a pleasure and a privilege. I'm incredibly fortunate. This is an ever-evolving field of vocation. It is becoming incredibly more and more competitive, and I'm very fortunate to have this post as Curator of Collections here at Oglethorpe. Elizabeth Peterson and I are very much two halves of the same coin. We're very different. We complement each other. She gives me enormous editorial latitude, which is quite rare. I've yet to ever been told I couldn't do something. I simply presented the proposals, and I've had her support. I've also had the support of Dr. Glenn Sharfman, who's the provost of the university, and President Larry Shaw has likewise given us free rein when it comes to the programmatic planning and implementation of the museum. But I always like to remind everyone, including myself, that we are first and foremost one part of a greater whole, which is Oglethorpe University. And that's a very special mission. We are here first and foremost to serve the curricular goals of the institution. We are here to make certain that the permanent collection is used as instruments of education. And it's no coincidence that 94% of the entire permanent collection has been acquired by gift and donation. Only a very small number of works have ever been acquired by purchase. And that's because donors realize the value of these works in a classroom setting and by bringing the classroom into the museum. And Elizabeth and I are continuing that initiative to get more students in front of the works of art into the museum and so they become more comfortable with the study of objects in the classroom. But here tonight we're going to talk about the history of the permanent collection of Oglethorpe University Museum of Art. As Elizabeth's mentioned, Lloyd Nick was our founding director. 25 years ago, he established the museum in this site. He worked tirelessly for those 25 years with great skill, expertise, and diplomatic aplomb as he cultivated relationships with numerous donors. And in many ways, the generosity that Elizabeth and I have witnessed over the past 5 years is simply the beneficiary result of the work of Lloyd Nick. He really blazed the trail, and we are simply beneficiaries. About 25 years ago, Lloyd Nick chose this work, which is a 14th century Kamakura period Buddha, an Amitabha Buddha, to be specific, which is the Buddha of infinite light, dating from the 1300s. It's wood with gilding and ushiri lacquer, but you see traces of the gilding throughout. He acquired this as one of the first principal works to enter the collection. It came from the collection of Mr. Thomas W. Chandler, Jr., who had been university librarian from the early 1960s. And by this point, this was acquired in '92. This is about 5 years before Mr. Chandler's death. And Mr. Chandler was an erstwhile bachelor of independent means. And so he could entertain and indulge his love for great works of art. And on the photograph on the right, you actually see how it appeared in Chandler's home in 1965. And let me just say, Eli Arnold is in the room this evening, and we owe a great debt to him, who he also serves as university archivist for all intents and purposes. And it's wonderful to work with Eli and to collaborate and call upon the archival resources of the university so that we benefit from those resources. And I should also say, just in passing, that because of initiatives led by Elizabeth Peterson and Eli Arnold, the museum and library are working much more closely together now and continue to do so. And that's certainly the direction we need to be going in for the benefit of everybody. But back to the Buddha. This is how it appeared in Chandler's home in around 1965. There was this wonderful, rich Persian carpet behind it, and these curled knot candelabrum on either side of it, and apparently it was quite dramatic in his home. But this was acquired by Lloyd in around 1992, and the day it arrived here at Oglethorpe, the workmen were still installing the locks on the doors of the new gallery, and the locks were not yet complete. So Lloyd and his wife actually spent the night in this room that first night because they were so worried about security concerns. And so, we're very fortunate that he took it so seriously. And I'm also pleased to report that as recently as yesterday, we had a scholar visiting from New York, from the Japan American Foundation, who happened to be a specialist in 14th century Kamakura Buddha sculptures, if you can imagine such a thing. And she examined the work, and it is indeed 14th century Kamakura. The only issue to note is that this skirting element, which is often broken away over the years, has been replaced. But after 650 years, I think we're allowed a little bit of latitude and forgiveness for that. Originally, there would have been precious gems set here and here in the sculpture. Those have long since been removed. But Chandler acquired the work at the famous Gumps department store luxury goods emporium in San Francisco. Gumps was established in 1861, rather, so by the time he was shopping there, it was already 100 years old. This is what it looked like in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is what it looked like on the right in 1960, around the time that Chandler was acquiring the Buddha. So I cannot emphasize strongly enough the caliber of Asian antiquities that were being dealt with by Gumps at that time. Unfortunately, there was some flooding in the building in the 1970s, and many of the sales archives and sales ledgers were destroyed. So when we spoke to Gumps a few years ago, they regretted that they could not provide us with a copy of the original bill of sale. But we do know that it is in fact 14th century Kamakura. It was a major acquisition for Chandler to acquire, and it was very savvy of Lloyd Nick to acquire from Mr. Chandler in 1992. But just to give you a little bit more context about Gumps.
Is it insured?
Fully. bullying shirt, and it rarely moves. But on the left, we're looking at an imperial jadeite jade necklace of 27 beads. Each one is about 1.5 centimeters to 2 centimeters wide. They were acquired by this woman on the right, the heiress Barbara Hutton. Mr. Gump introduced Barbara Hutton to Jade as a young girl, and she fell in love with Jade. She spent her life amassing enormous jewels and treasure and 6 husbands. And by the end of it, most of the husbands had left, and some of the jewels survived. But we think that she actually acquired these beads at Gumps. And in 1933, when she was marrying the first of 6 husbands, Prince Mattie of Georgian Russia, these beads were sent to Cartier's in New York by her father, E.F. Hutton, who was the famous financier. And they were insured for $55,000, which, and that was in 33. In today's money, that's 1.1 million. And Cartier added this sumptuous ruby and diamond clasp to it, and it was given to Barbara, given back to her. I think she probably picked these out of Gumps and sent her father the bill. And then he presented her with the necklace as a wedding gift. She ended up giving it to Miss Van Allen, a childhood friend, who actually had married this man 7 years before, and then Barbara married him. And then, so they swapped jewels and husbands. And it went to Van Allen, and then Van Allen eventually gave it to this man's sister, Princess Mattie. And ultimately, it was put on the auction block 3 times. The last time was in 2014. It sold for $27.5 million. And it was bought by the House of Cartier for the Cartier collection. They're buying back their own works for a corporate collection, but they bought that in 2014. But all that to underscore just how important Gumps was at that time to acquiring Asian antiquities and luxury goods. So Mr. Chandler clearly had quite discerning taste. But getting back to the permanent collection, this incredible sheet of studies by Eugene Delacroix was drawn in 1835, and it reflects images after paintings by Titian. It bears the estate stamp of Eugene Delacroix here, which is a stamp that was put on work in an artist's studio when that artist died. Their executors would record the contents of the studio with these stamps. And it was formerly in the collection of Dr. and Mrs. Michael and Lana Schlossberg. This is the first work that the Schlossbergs graciously donated to Oglethorpe. They did so in 2012 in honor of Lloyd Nick on the occasion of his retirement. Shortly thereafter, Elizabeth and I began to work closely with the Schlossbergs, and they have continued an unrivaled scale of generosity to the museum that we'll look at a little bit later. But shortly after Elizabeth and I arrived here in 2013, we began working on an exhibition entitled Jiki Tahanga. And Elizabeth had already formed the framework of the show, and she asked me to contribute thoughts on the porcelain. And the Japanese porcelain collection that we have here at Oglethorpe, for the most part, we have because of Carrie Lee Jacobs Henderson, who was the granddaughter of Thornbull Jacobs, who was the man who refounded Oglethorpe University on this site just over 100 years ago. And his son, John Les Jacobs, was a prominent physician here in Atlanta. He and his wife began collecting Japanese porcelain primarily in the 1960s and 70s with Ralph DeVille of Stone Lantern Gallery of Highlands, North Carolina. And Mr. Jacobs amassed a collection of about 1,000 objects. And toward the end of his life, he gave about 195 objects to the High Museum. They still have them. He gave a few hundred objects to each of his 2 daughters. He'd also given gifts to them over the years, wedding gifts and anniversary gifts. And the rest was sent to auction and sold. But we have now, because of Carrie Lee Jacobs Henderson's generosity, about 144 works from the Jacobs Henderson collection of porcelain. And this is the finest of all of them. And it was created around 1690. It is an Arita Kikyaman hybrid type. It's a very unusual object, again, made around 1690, in which you have this underglazed blue cobalt decoration coupled with overlaid red, green, and yellow enamel decoration. So you have to fire the dish 3 times. And it was once part of a group of probably 4 or 5 identical dishes. There's one at the Nelson Atkins in Missouri, and we have one. The other 2 or 3 are missing. We don't know where they are. We'd love to find them one day. But this is one of the finest examples he ever acquired. It was never intended to be exported out from the East into the West, but it was probably smuggled out at some point in the early 20th century. But we used this as part of Jikita Hanga in 2013. And now, later this year, we're staging an exhibition entitled When East Meets West, illustrating 300 years of artistic discourse between Japan and the West, mainly France and Germany. But this work will serve as the foundation of 17th century Japanese wares that would ultimately influence other artisans in Germany and France. This is also from John Les Jacobs' collection. It's a wonderful early 18th century blue and white bowl, which depicts Tsushima Island. If you just make that out, and it's on view in the hallway. You can look at it now. And this wonderful lotus form with brown gilding around the edges. It's really important to us because it illustrates Tsushima Island, which was a man-made island that was created in the early 17th century in Japan. It was created as a place to put the Portuguese traders so they wouldn't commingle with the Japanese inhabitants. But by the 1630s, when Japan decided they really didn't want any Westerners there at all, they expelled the Portuguese, but they turned to the Dutch East India Company. And the Dutch East India Company were Dutch traders who had very lucrative trade routes between the East and the West. And so even though the shoguns of Japan expelled all foreigners, in theory, they wanted the Dutch East India Company to stay because they could bring in revenue. So they moved Dutch East India Company men to Tsushima Island, and they stayed there until around 1830, so almost 200 years. It was very lucrative to a point, but that isolationist mentality did cause some trade issues with Japan and the West. But this, again, is a wonderful depiction of that. And if we fast forward to the 18th century, further into the 18th century, by 1730, 1735, Augustus the Strong, the elector in Germany, is forcing his artisans to crack the code, the secret of porcelain production. Porcelain was first invented in China in the 7th century AD. The Japanese didn't discover the secret until around 1616, when they took Lord Namashima captured some potters in Korea, including Ri Sanpei. And Ri Sanpei was at sword point ordered to come up with the formula for porcelain in Japan. And once he discovered the kaolin clay outside of Arita and added that to the recipe, it took off and it worked. So the Japanese were creating porcelain wares by the early part of the 17th century. Germany finally discovered the secret around 1720s, 1730s. And on the right is this wonderful example by Meissen of a tea bowl and saucer with Chinese figures. So Meissen is imitating China. This is not in our permanent collection, by the way. But the piece on the left, which is in our permanent collection, this is a work by Chinese craftsmen in 1730 imitating Meissen. So they kept going back and forth with each other trying to copy one another. They were obsessed with it. But this is a wonderful Chinese export trade tea bowl, not a cup because there's no handle, but a tea bowl and saucer in imitation of Meissen. And this was in the collection of Jane Liebrook's grandmothers from probably the early 20th century. And Mrs. Liebrook approached the museum about 8 months ago with her mother's collection, and this is one of 8 works that we acquired by gift from her. But again, it's a wonderful teaching tool to show the interplay between Germany and China and Japan, and how they kept going back and forth with one another. As soon as one would copy the other would copy the other. They just kept going and going because of trade. But all that to say that this piece, because it's Chinese, it's probably hard paste porcelain. Hard paste is fired at a very high temperature, and it was something that the Asian artisans could create as early as the 7th century. The Westerners could not understand how to make hard paste porcelain, so they made soft paste porcelain, which fires at a much lower temperature, and they produced that in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Finally, they discovered how to make hard-paste porcelain. But again, with the Chinese, because they were so clever, when the West started creating soft-paste porcelain, the Chinese then decided to make their own soft-paste porcelain. So there's actually 3 different kinds of porcelain when you're looking at this period, if you want to go into that level of detail and minutia. But again, these will be included in the fall exhibition of When East Meets West. Equally interesting, if not perhaps a bit more interesting, is this wonderful lithograph on the left by Paul Cézanne, The Large Bathers. It was donated to Oglethorpe University last year by Yolanta and Paul Melamed. It is one of the few rare examples of lithography practiced by the Impressionist master Paul Cézanne. It'll take front stage in the exhibition, and we will pair it with with woodblock prints such as this work by Hokusai, which dates to the 1830s. The Cézanne dates to about 1898. But the work on the right by Hokusai is Snowy Morning at Koishikawa, 1830. But you see how 18th and 19th century ukiyo-Japanese woodblock print artists influenced the Impressionists. This use of tonality, color, and composition. Monet at Giverny had over 231 Japanese woodblock prints in his home. They were framed in the dining room and elsewhere throughout the house, and they were on view for years until about 4 years ago a conservator decided they couldn't keep them on permanent view, so now they have facsimiles on view. But the Impressionists were enamored with Japanese artists of earlier periods. This work, which is hanging in this very gallery, it's right there on this wonderful large wall, is an incredible late work by Eugene Boudin. Boudin was one of the eldest of all the Impressionists. He taught Monet how to paint. He was really the patriarch of the group in many ways. And this is a wonderful late, circa 1882 pastel by Eugene Boudin of a shepherd and flock in Normandy, France. And it also boasts its original frame. You see it in the gallery. But that will also be included in the East Meets West exhibition. But that was given as late as 2 years ago by the Moments. But when we expanded our interest in Asian art, the Mohammeds followed suit and gave us this wonderful 19th century woodblock print by Yoshi Toshi, which dates to 1888. It's entitled Chile, The Appearance of a Concubine in the Bunka Era. And the color quality and tonality is just stunning. It's a remarkable impression. And we've exhibited this a few times before, but again, we'll bring it out in the fall through East Meets West. This, again, is one of the great treasures that came our way because of the generosity of Doctors Yolanda and Isaac Melamed. This is Henri Matisse, the reclining model of 1922. It's a masterpiece of lithography by Matisse. It is the first of 2 editions. It was supposed to be an edition of 100. They ended up publishing 85 copies, but we know it's the deluxe of the 2 editions because it's signed in the stone here in reverse, because when it's printed it comes out in reverse, and then it's signed with a wet signature here in the margin, and it's hanging at the other end of this gallery. Again, more gifts from Drs. Yolanta and Isaac Melamed. This is a wonderful work by Juan Miro, dating to 1967. The Vizard with Golden Feathers. And again, superb impression. The color quality and tonality is beyond reproach. It is an artist proof, which is something that the artist would have printed with his printer to make sure that everything registered correctly, that all the colors were behaving the way they wanted to, and only once the proofs were agreed upon would they run the published edition, but not before they did something called Words de Commerce. And this work by Marc Chagall, One Who Says Things Without Saying Anything, from 1975, again from the Melamed family, is a Hors de Commerce edition. And you know that because you see this wonderful little HC inscribed on the left-hand lower margin. But Hors de Commerce is literally translated, I hope I'm correct, Professor Lutz, as being taken out of commerce. And it was something that the printer and the artist together would have created a small number, assigned them as HC, and then the artist would have given them to his art dealer friends to encourage them to sell his work well. So they were never supposed to be put on the open market. Of course, things change, people die, and others inherit them. And then these things come on the market, and collectors go crazy because you want what you can't have. And because it was never supposed to be sold, collectors covet this. But they also covet it because it was printed before the large run edition of the stated edition. So the impression quality is usually quite wonderful. Other 20th century, latter 20th century serialized works, this work by Robert Motherwell, who was a remarkable postmodern abstract expressionist artist of the 20th century. He was actually married for a brief period to Helen Frankenthaler, also a member of the same movement. This is from the Africa series of 1970. It's a screen print, and it was actually handled by Heath Gallery here in Atlanta, for some of you might remember. During that time in the 1970s, Heath was a great force with which to be reckoned. They represented artists such as Alexander Calder, Frankenthaler, Gottlieb, and Motherwell. And we had an exhibition about 2.5 years ago, Mid-Century Modern, where we exhibited 12 works from the Woodruff Library at Emory that had been donated by a patron who at the time was a graduate student in the 70s at Woodruff. And she simply gave these things to decorate the building. What she was buying were original large-scale watercolors by Alexander Calder and others. And they turned out to be incredibly important works of art. So after we had the exhibition, Emory got scared. They're now all locked up. They're not on view anymore. But they used to hang in the foyer of the Woodruff Library, the two large Calders. So I'm still working with the staff there to try to come up with a nice solution, because I hate to think of them languishing in storage vaults. But again, the theme of American printmaking, we're going back a bit. This is John James Audubon's masterpiece, Roughneck Hummingbirds, 1837. And this was from the famed series Birds of North America, which was created based upon designs by John James Audubon. He would send the watercolors to Scotland, to Great Britain, to Robert Havell Sr. and Robert Havell Jr., and the father-son's studio would create the works by etching them and hand-coloring them. Robert Havell Sr. died before the project ended, and so Robert Havell Jr. took over the entire operation. It was massive, but it was all organized by subscription. So if you can imagine subscribing to Garden and Gun or Town and Country, you get a magazine every month. It was a similar idea with these. You would pay your money and you would be given one large print, two small prints, and two medium prints. But now the sheet sizes were all the same, but the field of the characters were larger or smaller depending on the caliber of the work. But this is an especially wonderful example. It was donated to the museum by Hank and Nancy Carson. Hank is an alumnus of Oglethorpe, and they've been longtime patrons to the museum. This was part of a series of folios that I believe was owned by the Charleston Historical Society. They sold it in the 1980s or 90s, and they cut the portfolios apart. They broke them up. The dealer who bought them did, to maximize his profit. But as a result, these are actually some of the finest impressions you'll ever see of Audubon. And when Elizabeth organized the Audubon exhibition with the Jules Collins Smith Museum at Auburn University, they sent their Audubons here to Oglethorpe to hang with ours. And it was night and day, because the impressions were not as good. They had much too much sunlight exposure, and ours just glowed like gems. Sadly, as a side note to the tale, when Hank and Nancy gave this work in 2016, they wanted to give it in honor of Ryan Gainey, who was a very famed landscape architect and designer here in Atlanta. And they did it because Ryan always wanted them to give them the print. And Hank and Nancy said, "We're not giving you the Audubon, but we'll give it to a museum in your honor." And we had it hanging on this wall straight ahead, pride of place, that night for the preview. And sadly, that night, or the night before rather, Ryan was killed in a house fire. And so now it's a memorial to Ryan Gainey. But he was a dear, dear friend to Hank and Nancy, and designed at least one wonderful garden for one of their prior homes here in Atlanta. As we go forward with American works, this absolute masterpiece, again, arrived with no prompting from Elizabeth or myself. Carrie Lee Jacob Sanderson, again, simply wrote to us one day and said, "I'm sending you some things. I'm cleaning out my house. I'm moving in with a gentleman that I've met. Her husband passed away some years ago, and she said, I'm starting a new chapter in my life. And I want to send you some things that you might enjoy having. And Elizabeth and I were in this room when we uncrated the work, and we were just spellbound. It was amazing. But this work is by the American Impressionist Paul Cournoyer, who was a native of St. Louis, Missouri. He studied at the Académie Julian in Paris in the late 19th century. He came back to Missouri, continued to work and to study. William Merritt Chase, who was by now a great force in the American art world, was traveling throughout the country and saw work by Cournoyer and went to Cournoyer and said, you really should come to New York, you would do quite well here. And he did. He did move to New York, and he did do very well. And by around 1917, he moved toward the artist colony Koskov at Gloucester toward the end of his life and painted there. We think this probably depicts Koskov, we're not sure. But we know that Carrie Lee's maternal grandparents were friends of the artist. Carrie Lee's grandparents, the Leshes, had a summer home in the area. And they acquired this painting, which is actually, the original is right there across from me. So you get a better view of the original. They acquired this directly from the artist. It has the original Vos studio frame upon it. And I will say, just to brag a bit, that when we got it, the curator of American art at the Higham Museum came over, and her chin dropped. Not least of all because of the painting, but also because of the original Vos frame. And so Elizabeth and I sent wonderful letters of thanks to Carrie Lee, and she wrote back and said, well, if you love it so much, I'll send you the other one. It's not on view now, but we're going to bring it out on view later this year. But this is one of the largest works created by Paul Cournoyer. As a Christmas gift around the same time, we think, although we do know it's a Christmas gift, we're just not sure the exact year, he gave Carrie Lee's grandparents the tiniest painting we've ever seen by him. It's 2 by 3 inches. This big. When Elizabeth said, I put it in the vault, if you want to have a look, the next morning I went in the vault and I said, where is it? I can't find it.
Well, I just wanted to add, I took a photo of it because it's like a little crystalline jewel. It's perfect and it's highly detailed. I took a photo, sent it to him, he said, how large is that?
Because you couldn't really see the scale of the picture. And so, and I went into the vault upstairs and I looked at it and I was like, oh God, gosh, what's wrong? Is it gone? And it took someone that shrunk it. Like hit it with a ray gun and shrunk it. But anyway, that's something that Paul Cournoyer sent to Carrie Lee's grandparents. Has the original frame. Fortunately, it had the original glass over it too. And it sat on Carrie Lee's dressing table in her home for years and years. But when her grandparents had it, I think there were people in the household that smoked, which was the custom at the time. And fortunately, because it had the original glass over it, it is in pristine condition. So when we opened it up for the first time, the colors were as rich as the day Paul Cournoyer painted it. But all that to say that as a result of Carrie Lee, our holdings of American Impressionism are now beginning to catch up speed with French Impressionism. So that's a great thing. But just quickly, to go back to the Audubon, this was something that Elizabeth and I went over to the Carsons to look at about, was it 4 years ago? About 4 years ago, for the exhibition that I mentioned that Elizabeth was organizing with Auburn. And while we were at the Carsons' home here in Brookhaven, Elizabeth and I were sitting in the drawing room and we were transfixed by this painting that was across from us that was not an Audubon. And it was this work by Hattie Saucy. And Nancy Carson said, John, do you like that one? I said, I love it. She said, would you like to see more? I said, I'd love to. And she showed me 9 more works in her home. In 1983, the art dealer, Rob Hickman, organized an exhibition from the estate of Hattie Saucy, who died in 1978. And he bought practically her entire estate, over 100 paintings, drawings, watercolors, and sketchbooks. And he engaged Thetis Rush to create a biography and a catalog of the show, which was toured throughout the entire South. Deanne Levison, who was a dealer here in Atlanta who's still living, she oversaw the Atlanta branch of that tour. And everybody in the South was buying Hattie Saucy's work, museums and collectors. Tom and Ann Cousin bought 4 works they gave to the Higham Museum, 2 they still have in their collection now. But Hank and Nancy bought 10 works in that show, 9 works in that show, and there was the 10th work that Hector Dewart, a framer in Savannah, discovered in the carport, which turned out to be the study for this painting. And so we don't have an image of it here, but if you saw the Hattie Saucy exhibition, you did see it there. And so that started a 3-year-long journey where I researched the life and work of this remarkable artist. And after 3 years, we opened the show last January here at Oglethorpe. It was the first exhaustive retrospective of the artist in over 30 years. We published a consequential catalog with 2 scholarly essays, and it was co-authored by Larissa Randall, who's here this evening, who's our intern at the museum. And the show toured to the Telfair Museum in Savannah, which was Hattie Saucy's hometown, and the Morse Museum in Augusta, which has the largest collection of her work, and they also have her archive. But shortly before the show opened in Atlanta, I got a call. It was the day after election of the president, I remember that. And I got a call from Hank Carson, and he said, if you want them, we're going to give you all 10. And so now we're the 2nd largest repository of Hattie Saucy's work. And the show just ended, and we went to Augusta to pick up the bulk of the show, including the 10 works we own. And so those will now be incorporated into this ongoing viewing of the permanent collection. But just to give I could talk hours about Hattie, but I'll be very brief. This portrait, also from Hank and Nancy's collection, which was donated to us, we now know is a portrait of Rachel Louise Shiver Saucy, who was Hattie's mother. It was painted around 1925 to 1935. We're not exactly sure when. And for years it was just known as the matron. But because of the research we did for the exhibition, we were able to unearth correspondence from family members that said this is Rachel Saucy. And Rachel Saucy's husband died at a rather young age. So she was left to raise Hattie and her brother Brad Saucy. They had one other child who died quite young, age of 2. But when Hattie was about 18 years old, Rachel decided that her daughter had serious artistic merit and skill, but needed better instruction. And she wasn't going to find that instruction in Savannah. So they needed to go where everybody went at the time if they wanted to be a serious art student, which was New York. And Rachel Saucy simply picked up, put her son in the care of relatives in boarding schools, and she and her 18-year-old daughter moved to Manhattan. And she began to study at the National Academy of Design, as well as the Art Students League, briefly. And as a result of the exhibition, we now know she only studied at Art Students League for 1 semester for 1 year. There was this old misconception about Hattie Saucy, that she was the result of patriarchal, white, male artists at the Art Students League, where she had studied for years, and they were the ones that really molded her. So when I was working on the exhibition, I went to the Art Students League archivist, and I said, I want you to send me all of Hattie's enrollment files. She said, that won't be difficult at all, it's 1 card. She was there for 1 semester, and she studied with Eugene Spiker, seen here on the left. And he was not a pleasant man. He was very full of himself. He had some early fame. This is around 1908, the piece on the right, which won a gold medal for Spiker. But the young woman depicted is his classmate, Georgia O'Keefe. And at the time, Spiker was convinced he was going to be the greatest thing since Titian. And that didn't quite work out. But he turned to O'Keefe one day after he won the gold medal, and he said, you know, Georgia, I'm a man, and I'm an artist, and I'm going to become a famous male artist. But you're a girl, and you're going to end up teaching at some girls' school. And of course, the exact opposite happened. And Spiker was completely forgotten until just a few years ago, and O'Keefe went on to become one of the greatest artists, male or female, of the 20th century. And if you look at market records, just to give further context, the most paintings ever sold for by Spiker is about $30,000. O'Keefe set a world record at around 40 million. So I think she came out on top. But all that to say, in addition to being a great story, the work on the left is a wonderful photograph of O'Keefe from 1963 by Todd Webb. And he passed away in 2000, but he was a great confidant of O'Keefe, and he was one of the few people she actually trusted to have photographed her at Coast Ranch. And this is one of 5 silver gelatin prints that Lloyd Nick acquired from an exhibition of Todd Webb's work some years ago. And we were quite fortunate that he did that. This has actually been on loan to the Booth Museum of Western Art in Cartersville, where it hung next to the original OKeefe, which is quite nice. But speaking of photography, last year we received, again, calls. People just call us and email us, and you never know what's going to happen any given day. It's wonderful. But we received a call from a woman named Jane Robbins Kerr, who is seen here on the left. This is a photograph of Kerr. She, and I have permission to say this, she is 84 years old. She is a native of Jackson, Mississippi, and she is a brilliant woman. She took up photography late in life. She had lived in the Buckhead community for many years, and when she had two small children, her husband began to exhibit signs of abuse. So she threw him out, and she gave him $300 and said, never come back again. And she threw out her color slides the same year, and decided to not use slide photography technique. But she loves to say that she threw out her husband and her color slides the same year. But she took up photography at a latter age and became quite good, and her work is now in a number of major museums, including the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Atlanta. She called us up, me and Elizabeth, last year and said, if you're interested, please come to the house and look at some things. And we spent, a day, if not two.
Well, we had to hear the stories.
We had to hear stories and more through the work.
I mean, good stories.
She's a brilliant narrator, and she's as good a narrator as she is an artist. And Elizabeth and I chose about 65 prints from her collection. And the work on the right is called Elvis Still Rocks the South. But we have a scene from the baptism actually on view in this gallery right now. But more recently, she took up painting about 10 years ago, and she just had a one-woman show at Spalding Nick's Gallery here in Atlanta. So she's remarkable. So I highly praise her work, and if you have the chance to visit with her, do so. You'll get a great education. But all that to say that this filled a void in terms of photography within the permanent collection, because before Jane Kerr's generous gift, we had only the 5 works by Todd Webb and a few other unattributed works of photography. Although some of those did include, and you may have seen this before, for those of you who've been to the museum over the years, we have an incredible small collection of family photographs from the Monet family. So Monet's haystacks and his car and his house, and it's just wonderful artifacts of his life, which have actually been reproduced in major exhibitions the last couple of years. We received a call from Sweden last year. They wanted to publish the photographs that we have. But that's Jane Robbins Kerr. But to get back to our bread and butter, one of the greatest strengths of the museum really has been and continues to be 19th century French Impressionism and other schools of 19th century France. And that is due in great part to the generosity of Dr. Yolanda and Isaac Mohamed, but also Dr. and Mrs. Michael and Ron Schlossberg. And this is a work by Constantine Guise. This was the first work that the Schlossbergs donated to the museum during the tenure of Elizabeth and myself. And they gave one piece that year. It was the Constantine Guise. And I love the piece. Baudelaire described Guise as the chronicler of 19th century Paris. And he drew everyone. And he just showed what it was like to be in 19th century France at the Opera, on the boulevards and so on. And it was just a wonderful gift that they gave us. And that arrived in 2013. Next year, they gave us 6 works, including this Eugene Spiker, who was a French 19th century Orientalist artist. It's a great teaching tool because it's actually a counterproof. And so what you're looking at is the result of taking a damp sheet of paper, placing it on top of a chalk drawing and running it through a press, peeling it back, and you get the same image in reverse. And then Fromentin took chalk and other pigment and worked up the composition even more so. So there's the original drawing, which is another collection in France, and then there's our drawing, which is hanging right here on the wall, which is quite nice. And then the next year, they gave us 12 works. So each year, they kept increasing the generosity. This is Julien Dupré, and it's just a magnificent example of the artist's depiction of both mood, spirit, and color and tone. But it's a milkmaid. And it's wonderful. I mean, I wish I could say more about it, but that was an incredible gift that they gave to us. And it's a real strength of the collection. And then this work by Henri Chaput, which came the following year, this was the first work that the Schlossbergs acquired with the specific intent of giving to Oglethorpe, which is an enormous gesture. We're very humbled by it. Elizabeth and I both were. But this is it's not quite a study, it's a reductive version of a sculpture that was meant to serve as the memorial for Madame de Gaulle at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. And so the tomb sculpture is almost life-size, if not life-size. This work you're seeing at the other end of the gallery, the vitrine, is about 15 inches tall. But it's a beautiful cast, and it has the Thibault Frère foundry mark on it as well. But this is also indicative of the Schlossbergs' collecting interests. They are passionate collectors of works on paper, drawings of the French school's 19th century, but they also love sculpture, and they particularly love sculpture by David d'Angers, who was a 19th century French sculptor and medalist. And we're working on an exhibition for 2019, fall of 2019, of the life and work of David d'Angers and his circle. And the Schlossbergs will be loaning about 75 works from their collection. They have one of the largest works of David d'Angers outside of Angers, France, and they're continuing to buy more. But they spotted this artist years ago. They would buy medals by him in Parisian flea markets for nothing, before people really caught up to what David d'Angers was and the caliber of the artist. And now, of course, everything's gone through the roof. They tried to convince the High to buy a lot of his work early on. They bought some, but not as much as the Schlossbergs would have liked. But again, this is one reason this work came in. But the other thing I love about the other things I love about Dr. Viz. Michael and Mona Schlossberg, in addition to them being great patrons of the arts, and specifically Oglethorpe, they have a contagious love for collecting and learning. They're constantly learning. He is a retired physician, she's a retired homemaker, and they're brilliant. They will go to great lengths to uncover the next great artist of the 19th century that we've all forgotten about. And they'll always buy ahead of the curve. So who they're buying now is what other people are buying 5 years from now. And they're just wonderful. But again, they're contagious. So they have lots of friends, including some neighbors, such as Robert and Sherry Gaines, who literally live next door to them. And Robert Gaines is a newly elected member of our Museum Advisory Board. And he and Sherry have begun collecting because of the encouragement from the Schlossbergs. And this wonderful drawing by Henri Monnier, 19th century work in pencil, which is actually hanging right here, that was donated by the Gaineses in December of last year. Other individuals, not necessarily influenced by the Schlossbergs, but still who reacted to actions of these collectors in a good way, are Mark Ellerkman and his wife in Phoenix, Maryland. Mark Ellerkman is the son of the late Hildegard Rials, who she and her husband lived here in Atlanta for many years. And Hildegard gave a number of highly important works of 19th century French drawings to the High Museum before her death. And after her death, Mark Ellerkman wanted to give more of the collection, which he had inherited as trustee. He wanted to give more of that collection to the High, and this was about a year and a half ago. Unfortunately, at the time, the High Museum had no curator of European art. So our nice neighbors at the High said, why don't you call Oglethorpe University Museum of Art and talk to them? And he did, and he ended up giving us 45 drawings from his mother's collection, which was wonderful, including this wonderful work by Paul Huet. And Huet really foreshadows the Impressionist movement in many ways. He was trained by Baron Gros at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He became great friends of Richard Parkes Bonington, who was a British artist studying in Paris. And Bonington and Huet were both enamored with watercolor and its use of depicting landscape. and atmospheric landscape especially. So Huet became this brilliant plein air watercolorist, but this is actually quite a rare work of figural composition. But what I also love about it is that you have the estate stamp here. We saw that with the Delacroix earlier, and this is just a little oval stamp with his name, Paul Huet. And these are the stamps that executors of artist estates would create and apply to each work in the studio when the artist died, so that there could never be any question as to what was in the studio at the time of his death. And it's wonderful provenance, because when Huet died around 1869, the studio was inventory, everything was stamped. And 9 years later, in 1878, there was an auction. Some of the things by Huet were sold, but most of it, or much of it rather, remained in family's possession. And when it comes back on the market today, when you see that stamp, you're guaranteed of authenticity, which is a nice thing. But again, Huet is another artist that the Schlossbergs have been collecting for some time. And when we had the landscape exhibition 3 years ago, they acquired a Huet in Paris on a Monday, and by Friday it was in the case here at the museum for the exhibition, which is wonderful. But Huet is a great artist to collect if you like 19th century French landscapes. His prices are still very low relative to the big ones like Monet and Renoir. Again, our friends the Malameds were looking at what the Schlossbergs were giving us and followed suit. It's wonderful, and they all know each other. They all like each other. There's no dislike there. There's just healthy rivalry, which is good. I encourage it a lot. But this is a wonderful work which filled a specific void in the collection, which is 18th century French school. We have lots of 19th century French school work, but actually none 18th century until this work arrived, which is by Jacques-Philippe Quaresma, who was very much in the style of Fragonard and Boucher that showed this 18th century Rococo culture of France when everyone was doing everything except run the country. And then they were all surprised when the revolution hit. That's a huge overgeneralization. But it works. But this is a beautiful work by Quaresma, and it's, again, hanging very close to Elizabeth. It's at the end of this wall, and it has what is probably the original frame, if not, it's a very early frame. And just since we're looking at works on paper, when I installed this wall here, the idea was not to overload the visitor with too much, but I wanted to convey a sense of what these works look like when they're in collectors' homes. People who collect 18th, 19th century drawings, we often stack things together, sort of eau de salon. And if you were to visit the home of collectors such as the Schlossbergs, you would literally see work stacked from floor to ceiling, very tastefully, but very much eau de salon. And so that's what I want to convey here, is that it's important to put as much as you can on the wall to show that, but also, because we're a university, we could do things a bit differently than other museums. If you go to the Carlos at Emory, you see not quite an ethnographic style of installation, but you see lots of objects in cases, because they're a teaching museum and they want to have as much on view as possible for the students, and that's what we're trying to do here as well. So that's why this wall looks as it does. Unfortunately, the next work I want to talk about, we don't have an image because it is at the Conservation Lab. But it was acquired by gift from Warren and Karen Steinberg last year. It is the work of William Tolliver, who was a brilliant African-American artist who lived here in Georgia toward the end of his life. He is not related to Mose Tolliver, for those of you who are familiar with Mose's work. Mose Tolliver of Alabama was very much a self-taught artist. And William Tolliver strove to be a more classically trained artist. But William Tolliver was born into crippling poverty. So his mother would save up money and she would buy these paint-by-kit numbers at department stores. And they would go to the library and look at everything they could look at on artistic instruction and painting instruction. And he taught himself, but as a classic academic model in mind. And he eventually became quite famous, but sadly he died much too soon, and he was in his mid-50s, I believe, when he passed away in Decatur, Georgia, a few years ago. But Mr. Steinberg was one of the executors of the estate, and through the wonderful graces of Roderick Hardy, who was a local appraiser here in Atlanta, Mr. Steinberg was encouraged to talk to Oglethorpe University Museum of Art. because Rod's assistant, Holly Bostick, was my intern two and a half years ago. She's now working for Rod. And when Holly was here one day on a project appraising works that were being donated, I said, you know, we really have very few works in the collection by African American artists. So when you hear of something, let us know. The next week, we got a call from the Steinbergs. And they gave us this incredible work. Again, my apologies for not having an image, but it's 4 by 6 feet, acrylic on canvas, Eve, reclining female African American figure. And it had just a slight conservation issue, so we sent it to the Atlanta Conservation Center just down the road, and it will be prominently displayed in the Welker Library in, we hope, 6 to 8 weeks. But we're working with Eli Arnold on that, so that's quite exciting. But speaking of self-taught artists, this is another work that came to us through the graces of Roderick Hardy. And it was painted around 1967 by a woman named Mattie Lou O'Kelly. And like Tolliver, she was born into crippling poverty in Northeast Georgia. She had to withdraw from public education at the 9th grade level and go to work on the family farm, and soon after became a waitress, a cook, and a cleaner. And she carried on those vocations for about 40 years. And she finally was able to retire and focus on artistic creation, which was her dream. And in 1967, just as she had begun her life as a full-time artist, she had this work at a flea market in Decatur. And the woman by the name of Susan Elman Zweig bought it from Mattie Lou O'Kelly. She was an antiques dealer. She just liked it. She thought it was interesting. And it's a full sheet of a drawing pad. And you can't see it in the image, but you actually have the spirals of the perforations of the sheet. And Mrs. Zweig simply put it away in a portfolio for almost 50 years. And when she and her husband were getting ready to retire to Florida, Rod was appraising the estate or the collection, and she wanted to donate this to a museum. So we got that call, and this came to us. But getting back to Mattie Lou O'Kelly, 1967 was around the same time she started standing in front of the High Museum and selling her work. And because she thought she'd find a ready audience, and she was absolutely right. She did. And one of those audience members was Gudmund Patel, who had just been hired 4 years earlier as the director of the High Museum. And he was a defining character in the arts of Atlanta. And he really liked her work, and he bought some of it. And then one day he was meeting with Robert Bishop, who was a great scholar of American folk art. And Bishop would go on to establish the American Art Museum of Folk Art. And he showed Bishop Mattie Lou's work. And Bishop immediately rented a car, changed his travel plans, and flew out to Northeast Georgia to find her in a cabin. And eventually encouraged her to move to New York City, where she moved, became quite famous, but didn't like New York. It was too crowded and too cold. But she was getting commercial success as an artist. So she moved down to Florida for a couple of years and ultimately came back to Decatur, Georgia. And she died at the age of 89. And when she died, financially comfortable and artistically successful, her obituary appeared in the New York Times. And so she finally achieved the acclaim that she always worked toward. But it's a wonderful story. Today, her work is highly sought after. This is an especially rare example because it's early, it's an atypical subject matter. She rarely painted industrial scenes like this. The condition is amazing, and it's hanging at the other end of the gallery. But all that to say that, like other areas of the collection, we are addressing voids, and we're having enormous luck because of the generosity of donors and patrons. I'll gladly try to answer any questions you have. We didn't go too far over time. I was telling Elizabeth I usually am quite brief, so I'm kind of glad I went full time this time. Yes?
Can I just ask you to tell them a little bit about course selections?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth and I have been working toward this goal for a couple of years now. And the idea being that every semester, this gallery is reinstalled with selections from the Permanent collection. but every work addresses one, if not more, courses on offer that semester. So at the end of every label, you see 1, 2, or 3 classes that are addressed with these works.
And they're connected to 14 courses.
14
this
courses so
semester.
far. So next year we're hoping to
And
increase
so
that.
we're sending out those lists to the faculty to try to encourage them to directly connect with the program and with syllabi.
How many students in your program?
I don't know right now how many majors there are.
At least 70, if not more.
But they're not just related to art classes.
Correct.
Not at all,
Correct.
no. I mean, the charisme is related to feminist theory, of course, as she's chased through the brush. This Campion is related to transatlantic romanticism. There are all
And
sorts of
a number of them
wonderful-
are related to my course on 19th century French realist novel. We will be meeting here one-to-one.
Yes, sir.
Are some of the permanent collections scattered around the university in offices and in common spaces, or are they too risky to do that?
Well, that's a common issue with university museums. At my previous post at Swanee, I spent the first 3 years pulling everything out of offices. We don't have things in offices except specific offices like the president's office. We have key works there. We have a few things in common areas around campus, including the lobby and common areas of the library. But the bulk of the permanent collection is in the museum.
You do regularly supply art to the trustees room,
Yes.
TLCC.
Yes,
in the-
that's temporary exhibition space. But those are usually works that have been loaned in, not necessarily from the permanent collection. Because what we're trying to do is balance the concerns between access and safety and security. Thank you.